Hey everybody, here's a little review of some different watercolor techniques. You'll need some scratch paper and lots of random materials that you can see most of right here. A good idea to start with is to divide your paper up. An easy way to do that is to fold it a few times to divide it into sections. So I'm just going to fold it in half 3 different times and open it up, and I'll have 8 sections. I'll show you more than 8 techniques. You can feel free to pick and choose which ones you want to put in your 8 sections, or you can combine them to fit them all on here. You don't have to label them, but I labeled a few on here so you can remember and tell a little easier what I'm doing. And it's important to remember if your paper's wet or your paper's dry. I'll show you the difference and what the paint does here in just a minute. So we'll start with wet on wet. If you are doing wet on wet or wet on dry, your paint needs to be wet. So take little drops of water and put them in every color that you would like to use. Make sure that when you choose your brush, feel the bristles and make sure they're really soft. The size of your brush is up to you for whatever work you're doing. But get some water in there so it can sit and make your color nice and vibrant. So for wet on wet, start with your paper wet. Don't go to the sink and get it wet. Just paint a wash of water on it. And then you can put a stripe of paint so it spreads on wet paper. Or if you'd rather, you can put a dot of paint. This practice sheet would be a great spot to tell if colors mix well. Purple and green don't mix super well. They look great separate here, but where they're starting to mix right there, it's turning kind of a brownish color. But if you're not sure what colors will do, try it out on this practice sheet to see if you like it. But you can tell the colors are mixing really well. Whereas wet on dry, the paper's dry, the color stays right where you put it. So here's the difference. It stays or it spreads. Here's a little example of kind of using both. So you could start with wet on dry, and then if I put a little dot on the dry, it doesn't do anything. If I put it on the wet, it's going to spread like that. So wet paper, dry paper, wet paper, dry paper. You can also just paint a plain water like that and do the same thing. Dry, if I touch where it's wet, it's gonna spread like that. One more time with that. There's a wet spot there. Touch it on the dry versus touching it on the wet, it spreads. Okay, moving along, saran wrap. For saran wrap, you need to start with wet on wet. So get your paper wet. If you wanted something more like a blend of kind of like a sunset, then you could do more stripes of color and blend them together like that. It is up to you for wet on wet, but for this with saran wrap, you really need to have some puddles of water there. So make sure you have some nice puddles, and then you get a piece of saran wrap or plastic wrap like this and crinkle it up, push it down on there. Make sure you can see the paint puddling around it. See the paint puddling there? And you're gonna leave that on there to dry. So it'll go on the drying rack with it on there. Here's an example of a finished one right here. So where the saran wrap was, it's darker right there. It looks kind of crackled. So next up, bubble wrap is the same idea. It starts wet on wet. Make sure you have lots of puddles. And take some bubble wrap, bubble side down, press it on there, and like with the saran wrap, you need to see puddles of paint where the bubbles are. If you're not seeing it puddle around there, then take the bubble wrap off and add more paint. And that stays on there for it to dry. And an example of that would be like this red one here, so you can see where all the bubbles were there. Okay. Next up is shapes. And like the other ones, wet on wet, put your dots or stripes, however you want to do it, just make sure there are a lot of puddles. Then take some foam shapes and press them on there. And those, again, stay on there for it to dry. And then when it dries, it's gonna leave the imprint. So here was a circle, a square, triangle, a half circle, semicircle, and after it dries you peel the shapes off and it's left a print on there. Okay, next up is scratch, and it's wet on wet, but I'm also going to show you we have some liquid watercolors. So this is obviously gold, and this one's kind of a magenta purple, and this has some glitter in it, but the glitter is settled at the bottom. So if you were wanting to use these liquid watercolors, it'd be important to stir them first. And they're similar to these, except for the water's already been added. The first step with these was to put drops of water in it. This one, the water's been added. So you would want wet on wet first. And then you can do liquid watercolor that has some glitter in it there. You can even mix in some of the other watercolor, regular ones. It's up to you. So get it nice and wet, and then take a toothpick and you scratch some sort of a design into it. Wherever you scratch your design, the paint is gonna flow to it, so it'll be a little darker. So you can kind of see it starting to happen there. And an example of that one, let's see, here's one right here. So this was just some random designs there. That would be an example of scratch. Okay, next up is blow on the paint. You'll need a straw, make sure it hasn't been used before. And this one is different than the others. Now we're gonna start doing wet on dry. So for blow on the paint, you need to start with some blobs of paint. So if you had your paper wet, when you put these blobs of paint on there, they would all streak and spread out. You don't want that to happen. So all you have to do with this is take your straw and, like the label says, blow on it. So it kind of looks like a paintball effect. And that one doesn't dry really any different. It looks like that when it dries. So the next up, my paper's full, so I'll switch it out for another one here. The next up is rubber cement. Rubber cement is a type of glue, if you're not familiar with it. And it comes with a brush in it, but the brush is kind of big. So take a Q-tip, here's the brush, take a Q-tip and just get some off of the brush or dip it in there and draw some sort of a design in glue. And then you need to let that glue dry. Rubber cement dries pretty quickly. It'll still feel sticky when it's dry, but it won't look as wet anymore. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. Also, with watercolors, this lid is for mixing colors. So if you wanted a color that's not in there, you can put a few drops of paint in the lid here and mix it up to make a new color. That's how that would work. When your water is getting kind of dirty, make sure you get fresh water as well. So oil pastels would work the same as crayons. Draw a design in oil pastels. And you can do wet on wet or wet on dry with this one, it doesn't matter. But after you've drawn your design, get some paint and paint over it. And the oil pastels are oil-based, so it does not accept the watercolor paint. It's called a resist method. So the oil pastels are resisting the paint. So make sure you press pretty hard so there's no paper opening in it, and make sure your paint is very watery. So that's what that does. Rubber cement will be similar to that. We'll come back to that. Watercolor pencils, you take a watercolor pencil, looks like a regular colored pencil, and draw something. And then when you paint it with just plain water, the color is gonna start streaking around. So the water's turning blue and purple. Another option for watercolor pencils, you could shade the whole area like that and then paint over it, and it's gonna turn to paint. Or you can dip the colored pencil in water and write with it, and it comes out a little darker. Salt can be wet on wet or wet on dry. Paint however you want. and then you just get a little pinch of salt and drop it on there, and you leave that on there to dry. And as the salt dries, it makes kind of a crystallized appearance. So I'll find a good example of that to show you. And then the rubber cement is almost dry. Here's the, so there were little crystals right there where each of those white blobs were. So that would be a good example of salt. Okay, the rubber cement's dry enough now, we can work with it here. So whatever paint you're using, make sure it's watery, and you paint over it, and the paint will start sliding away from the rubber cement. And after the rubber cement is dry, you can just rub it off there. So those are all the techniques, and what you'll want to work towards is a final product. We're going to tape our paper similar to this. You can make a design, like this one has a star, obviously, another star. But make sure your tape is stuck really well, and then paint each section a little different. And at the end, you peel off your tape, and you're left with designs. Some of these, they added extra, like outlines and marker, designs and marker there. Or some of them have multiple layers of paint too. Like this was splatter, which I should show you. So splatter is with a toothbrush, and it definitely needs to be wet on dry, because if you splattered on wet, your paint would go all over the place. So you just take a toothbrush, make sure it's wet, dip it in some water, dip it in some wet paint, and then you just flick the bristles, just like that. If you didn't want it to go everywhere, you can put some scratch paper over what you don't want splattered, and then go with that. So that one's splatter. Okay, there's a lot of splatter on this one here. If you're gonna splatter a lot, you might wanna do it in different increments. Splatter some, let it dry, then splatter some more. So after you would get the tape on and paint it all, add any details, you can outline if you want, then you can peel the tape when everything is dry. Don't peel it when it's wet or it will rip. You could decorate the lines if you want to, like that one. Or you could leave the lines just white. It's up to you. So good luck, have fun with it.